Welcome to those that might be new to Prime. We're so glad you're here. As I dive in, Anjali from Team Prime is dropping a few quick housekeeping items in the chat, the Zoom chat, so please check those out. And we are recording, so we love seeing you on video. We know you'll be on your best behavior if you know you're being recorded. My name is Sarah Kearney. I serve as Executive Director at Prime Coalition. We're a nonprofit that mobilizes catalytic capital to support climate solutions that could significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and that might struggle to raise sufficient support without us. Like when the time horizon to retire technology risk is too long for finance first investors, or there might be a binary deployment risk that no other investor is structurally able to take on. So at Prime, since 2014, we've supported companies at their earliest formation stages, but we've always been concerned about what happens when those same types of innovators are ready to deploy at scale. So very joyfully, and after many years of hard work, we're now seeing enough momentum in the philanthropy community to even imagine addressing that later stage capital gap with catalytic capital at a meaningful scale. In 2021, we, together with our philanthropic partners at Blue Haven Initiative and Schmidt Futures, Prime launched a research inquiry to more deeply characterize the capital gaps. That research is informing our own work, and we hope it's also helpful to all of you. In setting up any new catalytic investment program, we think about 5 phases at Prime: substantiating the need, designing the intervention, constructing the intervention, fundraising, and implementing. So the report you all saw was our substantiating phase, and now we're squarely in the design phase with lots and lots of questions that we're asking and design points that we're hoping to iterate through learning by doing. I'll say more about that later in our agenda. Before we get started, we're going to take a quick poll to give everyone here a better sense of who's in the room with us today. It's really an amazing group. So our poll question is, which groups do you most closely identify with? You can pick as many of these as apply. I'm going to keep talking as you click the little boxes, and then we'll close the poll at some point here. Our hope is that Prime's research can light a path for every one of these perspectives toward meaningful projects that might not otherwise come together, but can make a real difference on emissions reduction. We're going to spend the next 20 to 30 minutes listening to 4 experts with very different experiences of the gap. Then we're going to focus on solutions and Prime's own emerging early climate infrastructure, or ECI, program before shifting to Q&A. We're using this precious hour to support discussion rather than just presenting the report. So we appreciate you spending the time reading the report in advance, and we're excited to have a deep discussion with as much time for Q&A as possible. We're going to ask you to please hold your questions until the Q&A, but feel free to use the chat in the meantime to introduce yourselves, share where you're calling in from, what you do. My teammates at Prime are going to be synthesizing the chat after this webinar, so feel free to add resources or links that you think are relevant to this work and might help others here. And if you do have a few minutes to stay on after the hour, a bunch of us are going to stick around, just hang out informally on this same Zoom room. And depending on how many people stick around, we might do impromptu breakouts so that we can all introduce ourselves to one another. So definitely stick around if you have lingering questions or if you want to connect with your peers. And Margaret, I think we're ready to close that poll. I'm interested to see the results myself. Okay. Let's check it out here. So based on the poll, we know that our peers here are a really healthy mix, primarily asset owners, philanthropy, family offices, other asset owners, advisors and experts, entrepreneurs, and venture capital. So that's a really nice mix of perspectives that we need around the table to start addressing some of these capital gaps. Thank you so much for filling out the poll, and we're going to ask you to do more polls later in the call. You'll hear more from me in a little bit. For now, I am delighted to introduce Karine Khatcherian. She's the one that led Prime's research inquiry into the capital gaps surrounding first-of-a-kind projects in 2021. And she's now co-leading Closed Loop Partners' private equity platform, the Closed Loop Leadership Fund. All right, Karine, take it away.
Thanks for the intro, Sarah, and welcome to the conversation, everyone. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to bring together three amazing leaders in the decarbonization sector. Jennifer Holmgren's with us today. She's the CEO of LanzaTech. Lou Shick, Director of Investments at Clean Energy Ventures, and Hernan Cortes, who's the Acting Director of Origination at the Department of Energy's Loans Programs Office. We will hear from each of them about their perspective and firsthand experience of the early deployment gap. Before we do that, I just wanted to add my thanks to Sarah's, to the interviewees who are on the call today. You guys were super helpful in getting this research finalized. And we welcome your voice in the chat, whether you agree or disagree with what we're going to say and the speakers are going to say. Before we get started with the conversation, many of you are already aware of some of the gaps, particularly around first-of-a-kind projects, or read the report we published. But for those who didn't, I'm just going to give a really high-level summary of the four main gaps we identified, and they all stem from what we call the early deployments of a solution. The first two gaps relate to the innovation process. When you think about the solution, when a new solution goes from an idea in a lab to widespread deployment, we found that somewhere in the middle of that process, both late-stage demonstration projects and first-of-a-kind projects experience the most acute gaps. The third gap affects small standalone projects for young companies, and the fourth gap evolves around funding of development stage projects, meaning all the activities developers need to go through before a project can be built. That's sort of, again, the Cliff Notes version. There are other gaps. There are also non-capital gaps. But what we really want to know is from the three people on this in this conversation, how they've experienced it firsthand, to better get a feel for why the story is more complex than just a forgotten white space for investors. So we're going to spend the next 20 or so minutes discussing mostly the first two gaps around commercial scale demos and first-of-a-kind projects. And maybe to get started, Jennifer, if you want to start us off, when we were discussing the innovation process, and Jennifer was one of my first interviewees, we were brainstorming ideas on how to accelerate the innovation process. We were brainstorming, what the reasons behind why so many first-of-a-kind projects fail. And you said something that really resonated. You said, we can accelerate a lot of things, including investments, but the scientific process is not one of them. Your exact quote was, there are no shortcuts in science and you have to go through each of the steps. Can you, I guess, walk us through the process a young company goes, or at least should go, from that amazing idea in a lab to a solution ready to be deployed in hundreds of examples?
Thanks for that. I never remember what I say, and later I have to pay for it. So here we go. How do we scale a new idea? I've been doing this for 35 years now, and a great idea from the lab needs to really be optimized in the lab. Then it gets piloted, then it gets demonstrated, and then you build the first commercial. And each of those steps tends to take years. Once you get to a demo scale, if you're doing a plant, just buying a compressor is a 12-month lead time, right? And so what a lot of people often try to do is skip a step, right? And if you skip a step, you need more data than you think you need. So if you skip a step and you say, okay, I'm not going to build a demo, then what that essentially means, because a demo means I'm doing it in the field with a real feedstock rather than in my lab, you end up finding out that there was a contaminant in your gas that you hadn't considered. So these are all the things that come back and bite you if you don't do each step. I've seen many people try to skip steps. The most important thing to remember is the smaller the plant, the cheaper it is. So if you're going to optimize something, you don't want to do it on $100 million first of a kind commercial plant. You want to do it on a $10 million pilot. And so at each stage, as you go through the process, you learn more, you get more data, and then you get yourself to a point where you are willing to say, I can actually build $100 million first commercial plant, and it's not going to be a really expensive boat anchor, which is what can happen. The types of errors I've seen is like in our case, if we hadn't understood the contaminants in the field, you grow a microbe that's kind of a lab prima donna, right? And he'll do amazing things, except then it looks at cyanide from the real gas and it goes, oops, gone. And so you have to understand that. I've also seen people who have a design for a new idea at a pilot or demo decide we're going to save a lot of money by not building my demo from scratch. I'm just going to buy similar equipment and put it together. Again, then you're not really learning and getting the data to get to the next scale. So my point is, don't try to skip there. There's lots of other places to skip. There are brilliant people in this room that can help you finance. How do we accelerate financing? How do we accelerate the discussions that allow the governments to support getting a new idea into the field, right? That there are no blocking regulations. Things like that, we can accelerate as a society, but skipping steps kind of gives process technology, disruptive process technology, a bad name.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And you say don't skip steps. How easy is it for companies to find funding at each stage? So if you take it at the lab, then your pilot, few demos, first of a kind. Can you walk us through your perspective of where is it easy, where is it harder?
Well, raising cash is hard, period, end of discussion, no matter what stage. Because you need, especially if you're doing something disruptive, to articulate an idea that nobody's ever heard of. And so even at the early stages, it does get harder and harder as you get bigger and bigger in scale. Just for perspective, LanzaTech was founded in 2005. Okay, we built a couple of commercial, but we still haven't crossed over to where we're profitable. We raised over $500 million to get to this point. And that doesn't include the amazing amount of government support we've gotten. We've worked with in the US Department of Energy, in Europe with the European Commission, all over the world. So that 500 is just the tip of the iceberg. The bigger a unit gets, the more expensive it gets. And since it doesn't pay back at the demo scale, the reality is it's harder and harder to get cash. What we've done as a company is we focused also on strategic investors. There's two key elements. Crossing the valley of death for a process company, which is going to take 15 to 20 years to get to the first commercial scale. It requires a lot of patience. Most venture capitalists 10 years ago had 10-year funds. So, they wanted to push you to exit at the end of 10 years. Some of the new funds now are 20 years. So that's really good. And the other type of money you can get is strategic funding. A lot of our strategic investors, and I would say more than 50% of our funding is strategic, they want to see your technology succeed. They know it'll take forever or forever and a day. And so they're quite willing to be your partner as you get to scale. So what I have found is it's hard at every stage, but if you can mix venture capital funding, strategic funding, and government funding, you then start to get 3 different perspectives that will guide you. Actually, please don't think of money as money. Think of money as knowledge that's actually coming into your pool, and they will guide you. They will help you grow. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but that's how I think about it, Karine.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Would love to hear a little bit from, I guess, the investor perspective now. Lou, you're representing the investor community. Technically, you're a VC investor, but you've also coached a lot of entrepreneurs. You have the perspective as a growth and project finance investor from when we worked together. On top of it, you're also at least my tech guru, for the lack of, I don't know if you're everybody's, but you're definitely mine. What was, before we get to the investment part, I guess, what was the most surprising thing you learned across your journey on the subject when we think about first of a kind demos, things like that?
Yeah, I just want let me just react a little to what was just said, and then I'll be responsive to it. One of the examples that I keep in my mind for level setting, and this will lead into the other point, is when I was at the GE Research Center at the turn of the century. I love saying that. The crisis of the week was that GE had cloned, as in the royal smart people inside GE were convinced they were building an identical replica of a polycarbonate plant that worked really well in the US. They were going to build one in Cartagena in Spain. And it didn't get commissioned until 2 or 3 years later, and at least $1 billion was pissed away. And this was the people who invented polycarbonate trying to make a plant just like the one that they were already running. And the reason I share this is when you start talking about what is the cost of skipping steps, it's very hard to predict, and even experts get it wrong. So I just wanted to reflect that that's, I think, a really valid point and a really important consideration as you think about this. And a lot of it has to do with leading into the question that you actually asked me. When we were talking about these sorts of things in the community, people would throw out terms as though everybody agreed what they meant. So a personal pet peeve is technical readiness levels, which, someone will tell me their technical readiness level. That's fine. And what I would then do is ask them to explain what they meant by that to see if I understand how they're rating it. But even things, pilot and demo and first commercial. I had a conversation this morning with someone about first commercial, and I asked them to define it. Nobody agrees on what these phrases mean. And if you've got a very complicated matchmaking system where you're trying to match very precious, hard to chase money with interesting ideas, if you can't even agree on the fundamental language of what are you proving at what stage, what does success look like, you have a real problem in the ecosystem. And so the really surprising thing, and I think that this report and follow-up from it and some of the other things that I'm personally active in, and I hope all of you will be in, learning how to talk to each other about what risks are being mitigated by what actions, how long it will take, and what do you mean by that? I think it is really, really vital. People were just simply not even speaking the same language.
This is super crucial, and you're right, because even internally, when we talked with each other, we had to first sit down and define what we were talking about. Kind of following up on what Jennifer said, she explained the need not to skip steps. Can you walk us, since you've coached entrepreneurs and you're a venture investor, why are steps skipped to start with? Why,
Yeah, I
we keep on seeing all the steps being skipped, yet they shouldn't. Why are they?
Yeah, I think the short version is that, and I think, again, this is a really good venue to try and help correct this. We've been mismatching the color of money that goes with which development phase. So venture money, and you can apple polish this and quibble however you want, but venture money essentially is based on the promise of 40% annual returns. And so if you say, hey, I really won't understand how that demo project impacts my first commercial plant until I've run it for 2 years, what the venture investor hears is, oh, I've lost 50% of my return. If you have a 40% IRR, it's almost inconceivable to say, hey, let's be patient and take good notes about the better way to commission one of these plants. That doesn't mean that you don't need to do it. It just means that venture is the wrong tool. And so part of what becomes really vital is trying to figure out if we can sort out what should venture finance and what should the other participants finance. And it's not just money. I think that to Jennifer's point, and I'm really delighted with how you phrase this, we very actively court strategics, less so government, but it's vital. You can't do it without. It's just a different beast. to understand and to help pay for the parts that venture can't really or shouldn't really pay for. So can you define a scope that is venture investable, and can you define a set of partners that are going to help you along these stages of development? And you may need to come up with clever ways to get liquidity for the early stage investors before you've finished. But at the end of the day, really, you need to match the color of money and its risk tolerance and its timescales with the problem that you're trying to address.
And do you think it's just the color of money? Is it the incentives that are not aligned, which make, again, not just these finance or finance poorly or not with the right capital, or is it also, I'm reflecting on, I was talking with a company while doing the research, and they asked me a question. They said, our investors want us to do a demo within 12 months. What do they mean? How do I know what it is, I'm supposed to deliver to them? I am doing a demo right now. They want me to do a demo in 12 months that shows progress. What do they mean? How do we address that part, I guess?
Yeah, I think venture investors tend to talk in terms of proof points. I'll give you $1.98 and then you'll prove something, and then I can raise more money at a higher valuation, and I've essentially retired my first exposed risk. And it's good practice in principle to try and say, even the longest journey begins with the first step. Can we define observable proof points that would everybody can agree have mitigated some risk and give a step up in valuation? But when you have people speaking not quite the same language, and they have sort of badly matched rates of return and timescales for learning things, you get a lot of pressure to say, these are the 3 things I need to prove to raise my Series B. I need them by next Thursday, or I'm not going to be satisfying my pro forma. And those can be, sort of true statements, but not satisfying your pro forma is, not the same as I have learned the technology that I need to learn to scale this properly. And so I think often there is just a mismatch there. And it has to do largely with the incentives are to put up wins that increase the valuation of the company. And so this still basically comes back to, I think, a misunderstanding of the various stakeholders of who is going to need to contribute value, how long is it going to take, how are they going to get their money out, and can we get an internally consistent path from, that's a really great idea for something I can put between 2 flanges at a process plant, and that's how we do it now. And I think that as we're sitting here very urgently trying to reinvent the entire industrial system, we need to be much cleverer about how we address that and how we talk with each other. In the olden days, it was simply, that's too risky, I'm never building anything. I think we're past that now, but we still don't know how to build things and collaborate across these stages. And I think that this kind of convening of different stakeholders is really vital. So yeah, the incentives are not vague for venture investors. I think that they're not well matched to the risk retirement necessary for scaling large industrial facilities. And that's why we work with strategics very, very closely.
So you both mentioned strategics. It is great, and I think their role is needed. One thing we heard during the research is that while strategics are getting more and more involved, they're still doing it, not with huge amounts necessarily, or that it takes forever to get to them, sometimes even 2-3 years to get a decision on a single project. Is that what you're seeing? Obviously, one-off transactions can be different, but how do you, when portfolios get to that stage, late stage demo, you're saying venture is not necessarily the right capital, where do you send them? What would be the right capital there? Is it a blend like Jennifer suggested? Is it different? What's your view on that?
Yeah, so one of the things I think the way you phrase the question actually has the problem embedded in it. You don't go to the strategics later. I mean, it is true. The strategics have very long decision-making processes. And so the thing that we've been working on is trying to get strategics and their various, related stakeholders to engage drastically earlier in the process. So instead of sending your sustainability person to sit at Greentown Labs Houston, send a real P&L responsibility person to show up there. Think about, from day one, how am I going to integrate this into my business from the strategic side? it's less about the money that they put in early than it is about the insight. What hurdles would I have to cross for this to be considered, safe? What hurdles would I have to cross for you to really put some engineering meat into it? Where might you cite this, and what are the characteristics I need to plan for? You cannot have that information too early in the process. And so actually we do it as part of our due diligence before we fund a company, is we try and get our cohort of strategics at the table to say, sometimes they put in money, but mostly what we want is, can you give us a really critical and insightful response about what do I have to prove before you're willing to move real resources at it? And the real resources, frankly, are the people who run the operating businesses. It's not the theoreticians, it's not the R&D people. They're great and they're lovely, but it's the way things fail is getting it into the ground at scale with regulations and real labor and safety, and getting those people engaged and saying, you just don't want to go down the path you're on, but I see what you're trying to do functionally. Here's a better way. Getting them to talk to the entrepreneurs much earlier. So
super
sorry,
helpful.
I'm a little long-winded.
No, this is super helpful. And I kind of want to move to the third leg of the stool that Jennifer was putting together, which is the government. Hernan, you're kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the conversation. Can you remind us quickly how much the government has allocated to enable not only first-of-a-kind projects through the Loan Program Office, but also the new formed Office of Clean Energy Demos for demonstration projects, obviously?
Sure. I think if Build Back Better moves along, then we would be an 800-pound gorilla. Right now, we're maybe a very lean 400-pound gorilla in the room. So the Loan Programs Office has $40 billion that remains to deploy in renewable energy. They're in very specific buckets: in renewable energy, in advanced fossil, in nuclear, and in automotive. And these are for effectively first of their kind. In fact, for most of the programs, innovation is required. It has to prove that it's one of the first 3 deployments in the United States of this technology. OCED, the Office of Clean Energy Development, which is being stood up right now, they have approximately $20 billion, and they have some very specific focuses. And it's really interesting. I've really enjoyed reading the report because I've assisted somewhat on the OCED early stage, and they've stolen a bunch of people from the Loan Programs Office. But effectively, we've had this gap that's highlighted in the report, and the Department of Energy traditionally has sort of been the bookends, right? The research and development funding through grants, and then the Loan Programs Office for the commercial demonstration. And then there's been that gap in between. And OCED is intended to help fill that gap. And I'll get into that a little bit more as we go on. But yeah, between us, we've got $60 billion to lend and to, I'll use the term grant. It's a financial support, so it has a few more strings on it than a typical grant does. But yeah, $60 billion for these stages of a late stage demonstration and commercialization.
60 billion, you're addressing demos, you're addressing first of a kind. Why are we still talking about a gap? And maybe we can start with a first of a kind, the LPO program.
Sure.
Or maybe there's no gap.
Well, I mean, there's definitely a gap. Even if we were trying to address each stage of the gap, $60 billion is not a lot of money. $60 billion is a drop in the bucket. I'll speak for the Loan Programs Office because that's well established. We lend to the first of a kind commercial demonstration of a facility. We can lend up to 80% of the cost of a project. The loans that we make are very structured. They are meant to look like a commercial loan. So the project has to have a reasonable prospect of repayment. It has to be a real loan with a real expectation that we will get paid back. So it is there's been a demonstration project already done that has proven to us and our engineers that it is a deployable technology, that there's a market there, either a pre-existing market or now, I think in the stage that we're in the Loan Programs Office, many of the projects are merchant, but we have the internal resources to sort of analyze that market and make loans, even if there are not long-term offtake agreements. So we are on the back end, but we're trying to help demonstrate the first installation so that the private sector will come in and do the second and third and fourth. So that's why it's important that it look like a commercial loan, so that when it's gone through its shakeout period, it's starting to repay. Often the projects get purchased because the risk is now behind it, and then other investors and other lenders come in and do the second, third, and installation. So,
but if I hear you right, Hernan, sorry for the interruption, but if I hear you right, reasonable prospect of repayment, and although you're pushing the envelope there, if a project came and it's not economical and or the technical risks are too high, you don't have a contract that could come with some level of comfort on cost and guarantees, that would not fit.
That's right. The reasonable prospect of repayment means that we are the significant likelihood that we will get repaid. So, these are often projects that if banks had seen them and it was the third or the 10th, they would lend money to it, or other, or the capital markets. It's that that investors, lenders don't have the technology expertise or the risk tolerance to be that first lender into those projects, and we are. And so we can demonstrate it, and then they can come in afterwards. So they fit most of the, if not all of the criteria for a commercial loan. Just it's too risky from a technology perspective for the private lender to make that loan, and then it will afterwards.
Real quick, because we need to move to the next, I guess, panel very shortly. Can we switch to OSED quickly? I know it is planned, it's still worked on, but can you give us a sense of what the focus is and what gaps it's looking to fill, and is it entirely filling it, or do we still need more capital?
Sure, and I think OSED also has a very commercial outlook, but it's commercial support at the late stage demonstration. So it is much like the Loan Programs Office. It's a competitive application process. They review from a technical and financial perspective the viability of these late stage demonstrations, and they don't have to repay. These are it's a financial support. It's up to 50% of the cost of the project. So private, so equity investors or philanthropists or the sponsors have to fund the other 50%. But the idea is that if the project is successful, it has proven itself in a late stage level so that it would be viable for, say, the LPO to do the next one as a real commercial loan that expects repayment, or potentially a private investor to make that investment. So they have focuses. They have the carbon pipeline, the hydrogen hubs, carbon capture, advanced nuclear. They have their specific focuses the same way that the Loan Programs Office does. And again, I think they effectively fill sort of the back end of the demonstration project gap, but $20 billion is again a drop in the bucket. So even between us, I think we can carry some important projects forward, but again, it's not going to be all of them. It will be a demonstration, an indicative one in that technology, so that then it can take off privately.
Hernan, starting with you and moving to the others, in one or two words or one sentence, what would your call to action be for the audience?
Well, actually, one thing that I missed, and that Lou brought it up, and I really appreciated that, where he was talking about how that it's important that the investors bring the P&L folks. Before I get to sort of the takeaways, it's important. We have a lot of applications that come to us in the Loan Programs Office that I think have terrific technology, have great prospects for the future, but they don't have the commercial side and the financial side ready. So they focus on hiring great engineers, they focus on that side, but they don't necessarily have somebody in marketing and somebody in finance there. So those are things that either they should hire or they should contract with when they come to us to work through the process. We get, as I said, we have to have a reasonable prospect of repayment. If we don't have a model that we can work with, if we don't have the sort of market proposal for selling whatever widget they are making, it's very hard for us to come to the conclusion they are that we can achieve that reasonable prospect of repayment. So
in addition to money, more effort, more help needed to get them.
More help, either internally from their investment group or from a third-party advisor that can help them.
I wish we had another hour and a half to go over more questions with all three of you. Very quickly to wrap it up, call to action. Call to action.
I think I'm addressing folks who are not really familiar with our program. So I think this is really exciting for the Loan Programs Office and for OCED to let you know that we're here. We've recently made some announcements of conditional commitments and financial closings. This program has been quiet for years. In fact, for those years I was working in portfolio management, so I had to make sure that the projects that we lent to in 2010 actually worked. But now I'm back in origination, making new loans, and we have incredible support behind us from the administration. And I think we're here to, sort of carry the ball forward from what DOE has been able to do successfully for decades, which is the R&D side, and take that through to the, the commercial demonstration and to full commercialization. So looking forward to working with many of you on new projects and new technologies and helping to solve our greenhouse gas issues.
Super. Thank you to all three of you. Quick recap of what we heard today from all three panelists or participants in the conversation rather. The gap is more complex than a forgotten white space, in part because there isn't a common language or standards to characterize what we need and what's done, and in part because the risk-return equilibrium is not there. The DOE, corporates, and everybody are stepping out in a major way, but it's not enough. It will take collaboration between all stakeholders to help bridge the gap. And from what we hear, yes, investors like Prime can and should play a role in this. In the report, we outlined a few approaches and a menu of tools to help address these gaps. Super excited to hand this back to Sarah and Ananth, Prime's new early climate infrastructure advisor, to hear more about development of catalytic solutions and what Prime is planning to do around these gaps. Sarah, I think you're next.
Thank you, Karine, and thank you, Hernan, Jennifer, and Lou. It's really helpful to hear your perspectives on the gaps. I hope everyone will answer our second poll question as I kick off the next 10 minutes of our agenda. I'm going to be chatting about potential catalytic capital solutions with Ananth Pharshy. He recently joined as Prime's senior advisor for our early climate infrastructure program. Here's your prompt question. Of the gaps described during the panel, which do you think are most immediately important to fill? Again, choose as many as you want, and there's no imposter syndrome here. Whatever perspective you're representing, your answers are very valid. I'll speak slowly while y'all answer. In the next 10 minutes, our goals are to lay out potential catalytic solutions for the gaps at a very high level, share more about Prime's plans, and listen to suggestions from you, the attendees of our call. Ananth, are you ready? Let's go.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. And Karine, wow. Jennifer, Hernan, and Lou, thank you. Incredibly useful information. Thank you for that. Now, quickly moving on to the next topic, Sarah. Even before I started with Prime a few short months ago, I've been delighted by the mission clarity that the organization brings to the conversation. Can we touch on that for a bit? For those in the audience coming at this from a for-profit, finance first, or other worldview, What unique perspective does Prime bring to this problem?
That's such an important question. So Prime Coalition is a mission-driven nonprofit, which means that we focus first and foremost on social and environmental impacts, even if we're doing so using the mechanisms of venture capital as we have over the past 10 years, or today as we contemplate project finance. We also work hard to foster an atmosphere that is collaborative rather than competitive. And in service to our mission, we listen, support, lead, and follow, leveraging our financial and non-financial resources without pride of place. So we're trying to crowd others in rather than crowding others out. And we just can't do this work without very active participation from mainstream investors. And the project finance perspective that you bring, Ananth, is critically important to this work.
Well, thank you. But additionally, Prime also brings this unique experience in designing catalytic capital strategies at a high level. For those of us that are new to this, what is catalytic capital?
So in our work, catalytic capital comes from impact first asset owners like private foundations, donor advised funds, corporate giving programs, family offices, high net worth individuals, or trusts that want to prioritize impact and want to focus on companies or projects that might struggle to raise sufficient financial support without us. So catalytic capital enables, accelerates, or deepens impact that would not be possible without it. And it does that by absorbing risks that finance first investors are either unable or unwilling to take on.
That's great. Now, what role do you see Prime playing as a bridge builder in kind of filling these capital gaps that the report and Karine identified?
Well, so Prime designs catalytic capital for projects that have a very high potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and meet our definition of additionality. So in our venture practice, we ask the question, does this company require support from Prime or another catalytic investor in order to achieve its climate impact potential? And if the answer is yes, then the climate solution fits our criteria of additionality for venture capital. Today, as we're thinking about how we might apply catalytic capital to fill these gaps facing early deployments, we are evolving our definition of additionality to be less binary. So we're thinking about it beyond will it or will it not be funded. And for example, I can imagine projects where or early deployments might be able to receive financing, but the terms of the financing would fail to protect the impact of the underlying technology. And so for our early climate infrastructure program, we're developing a more sophisticated definition of additionality.
So we're having to ask questions like, are entrepreneurs, even the funded ones, receiving the most accelerative capital for this particular project at this particular time?
Yeah, exactly. So we're asking these complicated questions about the highest and best use of this precious resource, catalytic capital, which answers only to charitable purpose rather than fund life cycles or election cycles. So no pressure, but this is where you come in, Ananth. So recognizing that you're at the very beginning of our design process, how do you foresee catalytic capital being applied?
Yeah, well, given kind of the unique value of catalytic capital, that's an important question, right? There's only so much going around. So rather than choosing one approach at the outset, we're looking at this as an opportunity to learn by doing. Prime, we're hoping to invest catalytic capital into 2 or 3 demonstration of first of a kind projects by next year to help Prime contemplate, as we go through this process, a more permanent program. As we go through this, we're hoping to experiment with partnerships, like market segments, catalytic tools, check sizes, and also figure out our own internal processes around additionality and impact assessment.
Can you say more about the partnerships part, given that many of those partners might be here with us today?
Yeah, well, first off, it's actually very gratifying to see an ecosystem forming around this problem, whether it's the DOE's OSIT program that Hernan referred to, NYSERDA, green banks, private institutions looking to participate. So as an impact-driven organization, we're actually actively seeking partners who are aligned with us from an impact perspective. But we're also specifically looking for partners who are more kind of on the finance first end of the spectrum, where we can use catalytic capital to de-risk specific aspects of a project that they're not able to kind of take on. So that's one part of it. Also, following up on the seal of approval recommendation in the report, we're building out an investment advisory committee that will help us identify these impactful projects where Prime can bring maximum additionality.
So just to drive the point home, the objective it would be to address risks that our partners aren't able to assume. Is that right?
Correct. Well, broadly speaking, we're hoping to move technologies away from the growth equity kind of bubble earlier in the technology life cycle, as we heard our panel talk to, in the process crowding in cheaper project finance equity and longer term project finance debt into emerging climate solutions earlier. So the question becomes, how can we help demonstrably de-risk these projects faster so entrepreneurs don't stay reliant on venture money later than they should be? Now, also, but the problem is project financing tends to be very hands-on. So the big question is, will entrepreneurs go through these teething pains earlier in anticipation of greater gains in the future? So in that context, Sarah, I'm also struck by the non-financing challenges mentioned in the report and that Hernan also highlighted. How do you think about kind of non-investment interventions?
I thought Karine very helpfully pointed us in some specific directions in the report. Unsurprisingly, she noted that entrepreneurs are experts in their fields, and I think this mirrors what we heard from Jennifer. But very understandably, they only have a high-level understanding of project finance. So this non-financial gap opens up a variety of interventions that a nonprofit like Prime could support through traditional grant-funded programming alongside catalytic investment programming. We need to be convinced internally at Prime about why companies or projects need nonprofit support from us. It might be as simple as that the expertise is prohibitively difficult for innovators to find or access, or maybe the expense is viewed as unreasonable or low priority. But wouldn't it be great if we could live in a world where early stage project innovators could work with a nonprofit that would provide support for grant fundraising from government or from private sources, or do emissions or other impact assessments, or help them think through community engagement during deployment planning, or as we heard earlier, provide help with modeling. So as we wrap up, Ananth, what are your big insights in this work so far?
That's a good question. Thank you. Well, I'd say just right off the bat, all is not as it seems. Many promising technologies are neither being talked about, nor are they receiving funding, sometimes because of unaddressed risks, and sometimes because they're just in a neglected sector. So our job will be to ensure that everyone that's deserving from an impact standpoint gets the attention they deserve, which is really Prime's core kind of mission anyway. Second, in some ways, my job is to simply sit back and listen with an open mind to people telling me what they're struggling with, and to bring catalytic capital to bear on a subset of these problems that meet kind of our high conviction threshold. So it's actually a very interesting and great place to be.
Okay, great. Margaret, will you close the poll? I'm so interested to see what everyone is most concerned about. Okay, wow, that's so interesting. Okay. So the highest number of us are concerned about first of a kind or first one to N of a kind projects. About similar level of concern about pre-construction or development costs, and then late stage demos. Thank you so much for weighing in. I share these concerns. I will tell you, I feel encouraged by the momentum that I'm seeing among Prime's courageous philanthropic partners. I'm also encouraged by the billions of dollars committed to climate solutions that were not here with us even 2 years ago. I have to say, I'm very encouraged by the number of participants in this meeting. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions now. You're welcome to direct your question to any of the speakers today. You can raise your hand through the Zoom raise hand. You can open the reactions at the bottom of your window and click raise hand. You're also welcome to add questions or comments in the chat. I'll be glancing over there regularly to see what comes in. So whether you're asking a live question or using the chat, make sure you introduce yourself with your question. And if we don't get to every question or comment today, we are going to make sure to download the chat after the discussion and do our best to answer those through follow-up synthesis. And again, if you stick around after the top of the hour, we're going to try to get to your questions at that point. So let's go. I loved the question that came in early from Cheryl Martin. It's for Hernan. Where is the money coming from for the pilots and early stage demos that are convincing to the federal government to proceed?
That I think is the rest of you. A lot of the applications that come to us, they are a technology innovator that has sort of partnered up with one of the bigger one of the bigger energy firms, right? So which works for us because the energy firm that's coming in provides the sort of financial muscle, both in money and in ability to sort of talk to us about project finance. But that's not the only place it should come from. It's just where they've tended to come from for us. So looking forward to projects that come up that are sort of a joint venture between a philanthropy and a technology provider or something like that that can sort of prove itself. Go to OCED, fund that late stage project, and then come to us afterwards for the full commercial rollout.
Thanks, Hernan. Michael Bloomberg, I see that you have a question and a hand raise. I think your enthusiasm gives you the floor. Take it away.
It's the same question. I figured I'd just double my odds of getting chosen if I did that. This is for the Prime team, but anyone else is welcome to jump in. So I'm a visiting researcher at Cornell Tech in New York City in the Urban Technology Hub. We're particularly looking at non-pipe alternatives for energy transition. And so this question around the future of gas infrastructure, specifically gas distribution. And the question is, how do you all view the regulatory or business risk, not just technical risk? And specifically, we're having trouble finding folks who are interested in funding solutions that go up against incumbent business models. And so the gas utilities do not want to participate in anything that might reduce their profits. Same with electric utilities. And so, who are the natural investors when a market requires a market to be made, frankly? Non-technical risk, but regulatory or business risk.
Thank you for asking this excellent question. I'm going to go to two of our panelists. We're going to start with Karine, and then we're going to let Lou give some color commentary. I'm sure they both have much to say.
Sure. Quick answer to your question, which is not specific to regulatory risk, but when we talk about first of a kind risk, we're not just talking about technology risk. We're talking about all the risks that come in play as that solution, whether it goes throughout the phases. So technology risk is one of them, is the obvious one. Market risk is another. Adoption, regulatory risk are all present, right? These are all the reasons you have these gaps. If you think about technology, sometimes that's not the hardest thing in the equation. Sometimes it is. So the quick answer to your question is, in the report, when we flag first of a kind related risks, it's not just technology. It's new solution going through that sort of development and maturation, and all the other risks are present in that case. And the one you're flagging is definitely one of the risks we're trying to address, is the short version. But Lou, I think you had more to add.
Yeah, I have lots of stars. I'll try and be brief. I did a whole bunch of sort of internal teach-ins back in my own private equity firm. We ended up with 60 of these, and the unifying theme was, no matter what the topic was, the answer was, it's not a technology problem, it's a policy problem. And the issue basically is, if you think about a successful deployment of a new technology that changes the way you're doing things, you have to imagine that you can articulate what needs to be true for that to work. And often what that requires is some forward view about commodities, and that has, trade policy implications. Look at solar developers this week. what is and isn't going to be outlawed. I posted in the chat a horrifying thing. All of the people that I work with are very closely plugged in to Massachusetts, and Massachusetts tried, somebody in the legislature tried to sneak in something to outlaw consumer choice on their retail energy provider. And so the sort of thing that we're facing as investors is not only do the existing rules remain opaque and hard to follow, but they're not stable and they're not enforced. And so the real risk, and I think this is a real call to action for the people in this room. I'm going after my strategics with please get involved early. You can't fix this by yourselves. You need our help. With the broader group here, please, for God's sake, be clear and stable on policy.
Love that call to action. Sonam and Scott, I hope you'll both stick around after the top of the hour. I'm going to give the final word here to Jennifer as a panelist, and Maya, I am on the edge of my seat for your questions. So I hope you have a couple extra minutes to stick around. Jennifer, bring us home.
Well, all I wanted to say is on this policy issue, it's crucial for disruptive tech and technology neutral solutions. Or technology neutral policies critical. Remember that Tesla couldn't sell in New Jersey, and we've been really impacted by technology neutral, not having technology neutral policy, which says favors one approach or another. But that isn't what you wanted me to end with, probably. So what I'll end with is we have an urgent need to solve the climate problem. Things that you're doing at the Prime Coalition, things that everybody are doing are really important. Everybody needs a seat at the table, and everybody needs to be able to figure out how we can all go faster, because it's going to take everything. So I thank you for doing this.
Oh, Jennifer, what a geez, you're hired. That also harkens back to what Lou said earlier about the color of money and kind of fitness for purpose. So I'm going to make this the fastest wrap up in the history of webinars with a couple of concrete asks for everyone. Number one, fill out an investment inquiry form on Prime's website if you have a project idea that you would like us to consider. Two, email Maggie Cutts if you're a philanthropist that is interested to participate in the 2 or 3 syndication opportunities that we are going to be taking on over the next 18 months. Number 3, email Ananth Pharshy if you want to talk about projects in our pipeline and co-investment. And number 4, email Anna Goldstein if you want to chat about impact measurement and management for projects writ large. So thank you all so much. Hopefully we have the chance to work with many of you over the upcoming months. Have a wonderful summer in the meantime. Feel free to drop off the Zoom now if you're not sticking around, but stay on this same Zoom if you want to hang out for a little bit longer. Thank you so much. All right, we're going to let some people drop off. Sonam, do you want to ask your question before we go into breakouts?
Yeah, just a quick question, and thanks again. I actually just read the report over the weekend on a flight, so very good reading to keep us awake. But I'm Sonam, I'm from New York City, and I'm launching a venture studio to support diverse founders building climate solutions for cities. We work with infrastructure partners and particularly focus on urban infrastructure challenges and hardware challenges. Things like recycled asphalt or porous concrete or other things under your streets that you probably don't notice. And we've actually looked at Prime's model, catalytic capital model in our own structure. And I'm a couple of questions, and I don't know who from the group might be best suited to answer, but can you talk a little bit about the return profiles that your philanthropic partners are looking for through their PRI dollars? And then secondly, how you're using things like Project Frame and some of these quantitative impact metrics to make the case to your partners that these are, one, investable, two, have huge impact, and maybe how that has played out in an example that you might be able to share with the group.
Oh my gosh, I love this prompt. In lieu of answering it myself, which is what I'm like emotionally compelled to do. I'm gonna instead, because we still have 54 people here, and I think I want everyone to be able to speak rather than just listen to our few voices. So we're gonna do some randomized breakout groups for about a half hour. You're gonna see for a box is gonna open up on your screen, inviting you to enter a breakout room in a few seconds. I would love for every breakout room to like start with Sonam's prompt. I'm sure there's going to be Prime people in every breakout. Sonam, maybe you and I'll be in the same one, but if not, whoever you're with is going to be great. So we have a little discussion guide. I think Anjali is going to put the discussion guide in the chat. So also take the simple poll that's in the chat today. And we're going to synthesize everything from the chat. So Scott and Maya, just make sure your questions are either in the chat or talked about in your smaller breakout rooms.